keeping stuff to yourself and keeping it private and learning, when to talk and when not to talk.
And is that something that you'll continue to do in the future?
We'll see.
What if everything you thought you knew about Michael B. Jordan and Lori Harvey was only half the story? Because right now, while the internet is busy celebrating Michael's career highs, there's a completely different conversation happening behind the scenes. And it's not pretty. We're talking about whispers of regret, sudden silence, and a timeline that just doesn't add up. How does a relationship that once looked picture perfect turn into one of the most debated what went wrong stories online? And more importantly, why are people suddenly convinced that Lori Harvey's real emotions are only now starting to show? Is this just the internet doing what it does best, twisting narratives and picking sides? Or did something actually happen behind closed doors that nobody's talking about? Because once you start connecting the dots, the interviews, the timing, the subtle shade, it stops looking like a simple breakup and starts looking like something way more complicated. What started as a seemingly perfect, almost storybook romance between Michael B. Jordan and Lori Harvey has slowly turned into one of the most dissected celebrity breakups in recent memory, and not because of what they said, but because of what they didn't. At first, everything looked flawless. The vacations, the coordinated outfits, the quiet confidence in how they carried their relationship, it all felt intentional. Almost too intentional. People weren't just watching them. They were investing in them, calling them goals, projecting long-term futures, even planning imaginary weddings in comment sections like it was already set in stone. And to be fair, they played the part well. No messy interviews, no public arguments, no cryptic drama while they were together. Just clean, polished, controlled. But here's where things start to get interesting. Because when something looks that perfect on the outside, people forget to ask what's happening underneath. The breakup didn't come with fireworks. No scandal. No cheating allegations. No explosive social media rants. Just a quiet confirmation that they had gone their separate ways. And in Hollywood terms, that kind of silence, it's louder than anything else. Reports started trickling in, carefully worded, almost too clean. Sources claimed that Michael was ready to take things to the next level, while Lori wasn't quite there yet. Simple, right? A classic case of timing not matching up. But if it was really that simple, why did the narrative refuse to stay simple? Because almost immediately, people started picking sides. Some painted Michael as the serious, grounded guy who knew what he wanted. Others framed Lori as young, independent, and unwilling to rush into something she wasn't ready for. On paper, both perspectives make sense. But the internet doesn't like balance. It wants a winner and a loser. And at first, it looked like Lori had the upper hand. She stayed quiet, composed, and completely unbothered. No emotional interviews. No visible regret. If anything, she leaned into her independence even more. Subtle posts, confident appearances, and just enough distance to make it clear she wasn't looking back. It gave the impression that she had made a decision and moved on without hesitation. Meanwhile, Michael took a different route. Not louder, but more focused. He didn't address the breakup directly. Didn't respond to speculation. Instead, he did something that tends to shift public opinion faster than anything else. He doubled down on his work. And that's when the tone of the conversation began to change. Because while Lori was maintaining her image, Michael was building momentum. Projects, performances, directing moves. Each step added another layer to his reputation. Not in a flashy, overnight success kind of way, but in a steady, undeniable progression. The kind that doesn't need headlines to prove itself. And suddenly, people started revisiting the breakup. Not because either of them said anything new, but because the context had changed. Now the same internet that once praised Lori's independence started asking different questions. Questions that weren't there before. Did she walk away too soon? Was Michael actually the more solid choice? Did timing really play the only role here? It's subtle how quickly admiration can turn into second guessing. 1 minute, you're applauded for choosing yourself. The next, people are analyzing whether you made the right choice based on what happens after. And that's exactly what started happening here. Clips from old interviews resurfaced. Photos got reanalyzed. Even the smallest details, body language, captions, timing, were suddenly being treated like evidence in a case nobody officially opened. And then came the comparisons. Not direct ones, but implied. The kind that don't need to be said outright because everyone already understands what's being suggested. Michael leveling up professionally. Laurie continuing her life, dating, moving forward. Individually, both completely normal. But together, framed as a contrast. And that contrast is where the real narrative started forming. Because people don't just watch celebrity relationships, they build stories around them. And once a story starts gaining traction, it doesn't matter how accurate it is. What matters is how believable it feels. In this case, the story being built was simple, almost too simple. He became more successful. She moved on. And somehow, that turned into a question of value. But here's the thing that most people overlook. Success after a breakup doesn't automatically rewrite what happened during the relationship. It doesn't suddenly make one person right and the other wrong. It just changes how the outside world chooses to interpret it. And interpretation is exactly what's driving this entire situation. Because behind all the noise, one fact remains unchanged. Neither Michael nor Laurie has publicly confirmed any of these deeper narratives. No statements about regret. No direct comments about missed opportunities. No emotional confessions tying their past to their present. Just silence. And in a world where everyone expects constant updates, silence creates space. Space for assumptions. Space for speculation. Space for people to connect dots that may or may not actually connect. And once that process starts, it becomes almost impossible to stop. Because now it's not just about what happened between them. It's about what people think it means. And that's where things start to shift from a simple breakup story into something much bigger, something shaped less by reality and more by perception. A perception that keeps evolving every time either of them takes another step forward. And the more that perception evolves, the harder it becomes to separate what's real from what's being imagined. Which is exactly why this story hasn't faded away. It's still moving. Still being rewritten. Still being debated. And just when it seems like things might settle down, a new layer gets added, another angle, another theory, another reason for people to look back at what once seemed like a closed chapter and wonder if it ever really closed at all. And that's exactly where things start getting even more layered, because once a story refuses to die down on its own, people start digging deeper, whether there's anything real to find or not. The shift didn't happen overnight. It crept in slowly, almost unnoticed at first. A comment here, a viral post there, a few side-by-side comparisons that didn't seem like a big deal individually. But together, they started shaping a completely different narrative. Suddenly, timelines were being analyzed like evidence boards. People started asking questions that went way beyond the original breakup. Not just why did they split, but what really happened behind the scenes. And this is where the so-called insider talk began to surface. Now, to be clear, none of this has been confirmed by Michael B. Jordan or Laurie Harvey themselves. But that didn't stop anonymous sources, blogs, and online commentators from filling in the blanks. According to these circulating claims, there were moments in the relationship that didn't quite match the polished image the public saw. Not dramatic blow-ups, not headline-worthy scandals, but subtle differences in direction. Differences that, over time, may have become harder to ignore. One narrative suggests that Michael was operating with a long-term mindset from early on. Structured, intentional, and very clear about what he wanted his future to look like. Not just professionally, but personally as well. Meanwhile, Laurie was reportedly moving at a completely different pace. Not reckless, not careless, but simply not aligned with that level of seriousness yet. Focused on her own growth, her own experiences, and not necessarily ready to lock into something permanent. On the surface, that sounds like a normal mismatch. But the way it's being discussed now, it's anything but normal. Because people have taken that basic idea and turned it into something much bigger. Now you've got commentary suggesting there were behind-the-scenes tensions. Claims that conversations about the future weren't as smooth as they appeared. That decisions weren't mutual in the way they were presented publicly. Again, No proof. Just patterns people think they see. And once those patterns start gaining attention, they take on a life of their own. Then came the so-called reconnect ion rumors. Whispers that Laurie may have tried to reach out again after some time had passed. Not in a dramatic, public way, but quietly, privately. The kind of communication that never shows up on social media but somehow still finds its way into headlines. These claims paint a very specific picture. One where distance creates reflection. Where reflection leads to second thoughts. And where second thoughts don't always get the response someone expects. Because according to these same rumors, Michael didn't engage. No back and forth. No reopening of old conversations. Just distance. Now, whether that's true or not is impossible to confirm. But the idea itself. That's what people are reacting to. Because it flips the original narrative. It takes the image of Laurie as the one who moved on effortlessly and replaces it with something more complicated. Something that suggests maybe things weren't as clear-cut as they seemed. And that's all it takes for the internet to run with it. Suddenly, every past moment gets re-examined through this new lens. Old captions start looking different. Interviews take on new meanings. Even silence starts to feel like a statement. And then, just as that speculation reaches its peak, another layer gets added to the mix. Future. Because when his name enters the conversation, things rarely stay simple. Future has a history with Laurie, and more importantly, a history of expressing his thoughts in ways that are anything but subtle. Whether through music, social media, or indirect references, he's never been someone to completely stay out of a narrative, especially one he was once part of. So when people noticed his reactions, his tone, his timing, it didn't go unnoticed. Some interpreted it as coincidence. Others saw it as calculated. Comments, lyrics, throwback lines, all being pulled back into the spotlight and analyzed in the context of what's happening now. And that's when the situation starts to feel less like a closed chapter and more like an ongoing storyline with multiple angles. Because now it's not just about Michael and Laurie. It's about how past relationships, public perception, and current success all intersect in one continuous narrative. A narrative where every move, intentional or not, gets added to the bigger picture. And the more pieces get added, the more complicated that picture becomes. At this point, public reaction is no longer just curiosity. It's division. You've got one side saying that Michael simply stayed focused, did his work, and naturally progressed in his career. That his current position is the result of consistency, not circumstance. Another side argues that the timing is too noticeable to ignore. That the contrast between then and now raises questions, even if those questions don't have clear answers. And then there's a third perspective. One that steps back from both narratives and points out something much simpler. That maybe, just maybe, nothing dramatic happened at all. That maybe this entire situation is being built on assumptions layered over normal life decisions. Because when you strip everything down, remove the rumors, ignore the speculation, take away the commentary, you're left with two people who dated, broke up, and continued living their lives. That's it. But simplicity doesn't trend. Complication does. So the story keeps evolving. More theories. More interpretations. More attempts to find meaning in moments that might not have been meant to carry any. And as all of this continues to build, one thing becomes very clear. This isn't just about what happened between them anymore. It's about how people choose to interpret what they see, and what they don't see. And the moment interpretation takes over, reality becomes harder to pin down. Because now, every new development, every career move, every public appearance, every absence of a statement, gets pulled into the narrative whether it belongs there or not. And just when it seems like the speculation might start slowing down, another question emerges. Not about the past this time, but about the present. Because if all of these assumptions are being made based on what people think happened, then what's actually happening now? And more importantly, who's really moved on, and who's just being seen that way? And that question, who has really moved on, and who just appears to have, becomes the center of everything as the story keeps unfolding in real time. Because now the focus isn't just on what happened between Michael B. Jordan and Laurie Harvey, it's on what their lives look like after each other. And this is where perception starts doing most of the work. On one side, you have Michael, consistent, disciplined, and visibly locked into his career trajectory. Every appearance, every project, every move feels aligned with a bigger plan. He's not overly expressive about his personal life, not reacting to rumors, not feeding into speculation. And in today's world, that kind of silence, people read it as strength. They interpret it as focus, as growth, as someone who took a situation, learned from it, and elevated. But here's the catch. None of that actually confirms anything about how he feels. It only confirms how he presents. Because public image and private emotion are rarely the same thing. And yet, that distinction often gets lost. Now on the other side, you have Laurie. Still visible, still active, still moving through her own life at her own pace. But the difference is in how her moves are being interpreted now compared to before. At one point, her independence was framed as confidence. Now, some people are trying to reframe that same independence as uncertainty. The exact same actions, just viewed through a completely different lens. And that shift says more about the audience than it does about her. Because when people decide on a narrative, they start adjusting every detail to fit it. If she's seen out, it becomes a statement. If she's quiet, it becomes a question. If she moves on, it becomes a comparison. And if she doesn't say anything at all, it somehow becomes confirmation of something nobody can actually prove. That's the strange part about all of this. Silence is being treated like evidence. And not just from her side, but from his too. Because the more both of them choose not to engage publicly, the more space it creates for speculation to grow. And that speculation has reached a point where even neutral moments get turned into talking points. A simple appearance at an event. A brief interaction caught on camera. Even something as small as who acknowledges who, and who doesn't, gets analyzed like it carries deeper meaning. And sometimes, it really doesn't. But that doesn't stop the conversation. Because once a story reaches this level of attention, it becomes self-sustaining. It doesn't need new facts. It just needs new angles. And right now, the angle that's getting the most attention is this idea of realization. The idea that time has passed, perspectives have shifted, and maybe, just maybe, there are thoughts now that weren't there before. Not confirmed thoughts. Not expressed thoughts. Just possibilities. And people are running with them. They're building entire narratives around what someone might be feeling based on what they can see from the outside. And that's where things start to blur even more. Because at this point, the conversation isn't about facts anymore. It's about interpretation layered on top of interpretation. One person says Michael's silence means he's completely moved on. Another says it means he's protecting his peace. Someone else says Laurie's continued visibility means she's unfazed. Another says it's masking something deeper. None of these statements are confirmed. But all of them sound convincing depending on who's listening. And that's how narratives stick. Not because they're proven, but because they feel believable. Now add in the influence of past relationships, public expectations, and the natural human tendency to compare outcomes, and suddenly, a private breakup turns into a long-running discussion that refuses to settle. Even the involvement of figures like Future, whether direct or indirect, adds another layer of complexity. Not because of anything new he's said recently, but because of how his past actions are being pulled back into the present conversation. Old lyrics, old comments, old reactions, all being reinterpreted in light of what's happening now. And again, none of it changes what actually happened, but it definitely changes how people view it. Which brings everything back to the same central point. This situation isn't being driven by confirmed information. It's being driven by perception. Perception of growth. Perception of regret. Perception of who made the right decision. And perception is one of the most powerful forces in any public story. Because once it takes hold, it's very hard to shift. So where does that leave things now? In a place where nothing is officially unresolved, but nothing feels fully settled either. Michael continues to move forward in his career, building on what is already established. Laurie continues to live her life, making her own choices, navigating her own path. And the world continues to watch both of them, not for what they say, but for what people think their actions mean. And maybe that's the most honest takeaway from all of this. Not that there's some hidden truth waiting to be uncovered. Not that one person secretly regrets everything while the other has completely moved on. But that when two high-profile lives intersect and then separate, the story doesn't actually end when the relationship does. It evolves. It gets reinterpreted. It gets reshaped over time based on what happens next. And sometimes, the version of the story that people believe has more to do with timing and perception than it does with reality. So the real question isn't whether Laurie Harvey has real emotions that are just now being revealed. And it's not whether Michael B. Jordan has quietly closed that chapter for good. The real question is this: how much of what we think we know is actually based on facts? And how much of it is just a story that got repeated enough times to feel true? So now it all comes down to you. After everything we just broke down, all the timelines, the silence, the speculation, the way the narrative completely flipped, what do you actually believe is going on here? Do you think Laurie Harvey is really feeling some type of way now that Michael B. Jordan is hitting new levels in his career? Or is this just another case of the internet creating a storyline that sounds good, but isn't actually real? And let's be honest for a second. If roles were reversed, would people still be saying the same things? Or would the entire narrative look completely different? Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about them anymore. It's about how fast people judge, assume, and decide who won a situation they were never part of. So I want to hear your real thoughts. Was this just bad timing between two people moving in different directions? Or do you think there's something deeper that still hasn't come out yet? Drop your opinion in the comments, don't hold back. And if you're into breakdowns like this, where we separate hype from reality, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay locked in. Because the next story, it might be even messier than this one.